Welcome to Chapter 8.3, The High and Late Middle Ages, the Crusades and the Wider World. The Crusades were a series of wars in which Christians fought Muslims for control of the Middle Eastern lands. The Crusades were destructive, but ultimately opened a wider world to Europeans and increased the pace of change. In 1071, the Seljuk Turks conquered the Byzantine lands in Asia Minor, and they moved into the Holy Land. The Byzantine Emperor asked Pope Urban II to help, and Urban launched the Crusades. The Crusades were supposed to try to free the Holy Land. Only the First Crusade, though, was successful for the Christians, who managed to capture Jerusalem in 1099. In the Second Crusade, Jerusalem fell to the great Muslim leader Saladin. He agreed to reopen the city to Christian pilgrims after Crusaders failed to take Jerusalem in the Third Crusade. By the Fourth Crusade in 1202, knights were fighting other Christians to help Venice against the Byzantine trade rival. Crusaders captured and looted the Byzantine capital, Constantinople, and the Crusades left a legacy of hatred in the Middle East and Europe. They also produced vast changes in society. In the Middle East, Muslims began to reunify. In Europe, trade increased, and the Crusades encouraged the growth of a money economy. Monarchs gained the right to collect taxes to support the crusade. The experience of the Crusaders in the Muslim world introduced Europeans to new places. In 1271, the Venetian Marco Polo headed for China and returned home to write a book. His and the Crusaders' experience brought new knowledge to Europe. Religious zeal continued in Europe, however. Around 1100, Christian kingdoms in Spain began to struggle in something called the Reconquista, or the Reconquest. The purpose was to expel the Muslims who had lived there since the 700s. In 1469, Ferdinand and Isabella married, and they unified Spain. They captured the last Muslim stronghold, Granada, in 1492, and under Muslim rule, Christians, Jews, and Muslims had been able to live together, but under Ferdinand and Isabella, who wanted to impose a unified single religion, the freedoms that those religious groups had felt under the Muslims was taken away. So, with the help of the Inquisition, Ferdinand and Isabella began to launch a brutal campaign against Muslims and Jews. Those found guilty of heresy were burnt at the stake, and more than 150,000 people, mostly Muslims and Jews, fled from Spain, taking all their skills and learning with them. Europe prior to the Crusades had been very isolated. The Christian part of Europe had been experiencing waves of invasions in the 900s, but then for about 100 years, things had settled down, and most people were living in manors or under the protection of a feudal lord, and so there was very little movement, very little trade, and it was fairly isolated. In Muslim Spain, there was a little bit more advancement in society. There were scholars, and trade was happening with other places, such as India and China and West Africa. There was more learning going on. There had been many different pieces of literature that had been saved from the Greek civilization, had been translated into Arabic, and were being studied by Muslim scholars. By the 1050s, the Seljuk Turks, who were Muslim, had spread up or over from the more east, and they had hit the Levant area, which is the east coast of the Mediterranean. And they had conquered Jerusalem and had made it very dangerous for pilgrims to travel to the birthplace of Jesus. In Christendom, there had been some serious difficulties between the Eastern and the Western Church. The Eastern Church spoke Greek and was headed by patriarchs who resided in Byzantium or Constantinople, and the Western Church was headed by the Pope. The Pope believed that a crusade would lead to a strong Roman influence in the Greek territories and hopefully eventually lead to a reunion of these two churches. So he was motivated for political and religious reasons. But in 1095, Pope Urban II received a request from the Eastern Church to try to save or to help them with the Muslim invaders. Pope Urban II gave probably one of the most rousing speeches in all of history because it ignited a fire into all of Europe and created the Crusade frenzy that lasted for almost 200 years or 300 years, depending on how you calculate the different crusades. But he urged Christian knights who had been fighting one another to direct their energies against the true enemies of God, the Muslims. Urban proclaimed an indulgence for, or a remission from the penalties of sin to those who would fight for and regain the holy city of Jerusalem. So this speech was so dramatic that many thousands of people dropped what they were doing and started going towards the Holy Land. Although most of the Crusaders were from France, there were also many pilgrims from other countries that started to walk towards the Levant. The nobles were motivated to go on crusade because of the chance for excitement and foreign travel, but even more the opportunity of gaining territory and land in the Middle East. Many younger sons of noble birth wanted to go on crusade because this was an opportunity to create their own fief in a place that was not yet taken over by other noble people. So many nobles had to borrow a lot of money, usually from the townspeople in their territories or from the Jewish population, to try to pay for the expenditures of going on crusade. But going on crusade was extremely fashionable. It was seen as a great prestige to your ego if you had been on crusade. The first crusade was from 1096 to 1099, and it was the most successful crusade because of the extreme motivation of the people who were going on crusade. They could never really agree on a leader, though, and they had serious problems with their supply line, and lots of starvation and disease took over the army. So the Turks actually slaughtered hundreds of non-combatants, people who were just traveling along with the Crusaders. But their cry of "God wills it" was a passionate and mobilizing emotional motivator. The army pressed on, and in 1099 they were able to capture Jerusalem. The Arabs were taken by surprise, and their disunity was probably the main reason why the Crusaders were able to capture not only Jerusalem, but Edessa and Tripoli and Antioch as well. So they created 4 different Crusader kingdoms up and down the Levant coast, which is the eastern Mediterranean coast, in what is today Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. Unfortunately, in 1187, Jerusalem was again captured by the Muslims, and it was never regained again by European fighters, although they tried many different times. There were about 8 different papally approved expeditions, but there were a lot of other non-sanctioned crusades, some involving just children, which was sadly ended in many of those children being captured and sold as slaves. And there were peasants that went along without military aid, and it was a big chaos, basically. In the end, the Crusades did not achieve their goal of retaking permanently the Holy Land. And during the Third Crusade, the Third Crusade is probably the most famous crusade, because that's the crusade that Richard the Lionhearted and Philip II of France, also known as Philip Augustus, went on together. They could not agree or get along with one another, and they eventually had to part ways because they couldn't get along, and that was probably one of the main reasons why their expedition was a failure. Well, Richard the Lionhearted tries to get back to his country, of England, but he is captured as he is crossing through Germany, held for ransom, and his country has to pay huge amounts of money to try to get him out. And we actually never really hear about whether he doesn't make it back home. And John is the one who takes over as King of England. But this second crusade the Third Crusade was quite famous. Saladin was the Muslim leader during this time, and Saladin was a military genius and also a very admirable person. He treated the Crusaders with a lot more courtesy and morality than the Crusaders treated him. During the Fourth Crusade, they basically ran out of funding, the leaders of the crusade, and so they hoped to gain more supplies and money from their supposed allies, the Byzantine Empire, who were Greek Christians. But when they showed up in Constantinople, or at the gates of Constantinople, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire was extremely disturbed at having such a huge military force outside his gates, and of course he would not let them in. And the Crusaders grew angry with the cold shoulder they were receiving, and they eventually decide to attack Constantinople, their Christian ally, and it was a day of great carnage. Actually, it was more like a week or a month of great carnage. The Crusaders went in and basically stole huge amounts of booty from the Byzantine people. This was a great shame to the Crusaders, because having Christians attacking Christians proved to their adversaries that their motivations were simply mercenary. They were not religious at all. It nullified the ideal of the crusade. By 1291, Muslim armies had completely recaptured all of the areas that had been captured at first by Christian troops, and the Holy Land was now completely Muslim. To Europeans, the Crusades were an embarrassing blip in history, but to the Muslims, it's also been a minor issue. I don't think that the Muslim historians see that as a large part of their history. The Crusaders were more of an annoyance than a true threat to Islam. Islam continued to grow and become a larger religion after that. But there were some major impacts that the Crusades had on the European civilization. First of all, the European economies began to really expand based on the exposure that Europeans had to products and practices in the Middle East. European merchants, especially from Italy, established communities in the Crusader states. And after those kingdoms collapsed to Muslim rulers, they were still encouraged to trade with European businessmen. And so the commerce between the East and the West continued to flow even after the Crusades had ended. Another effect of the Crusades was that the monarch's power grew considerably. First of all, the fractious noblemen who had been giving the monarch so much trouble were siphoned off to go to the Crusades, which made the monarchs more powerful because of the lack of competition. Also, the monarchs were able to raise large armies during this time, which influenced their power over the rest of their territories. And they were also able to raise taxation for this purpose. In the Middle Ages, taxes were seen as a thing to do when there was an issue of great distress. So taxation was not necessarily seen as something that occurred regularly, but rather was taken when there was a great need. And this, obviously, the Crusades were considered a great need, and so people were able to give more effectively, or they at least were willing to give more, and this enabled the monarchs to expand their power. The Crusades also helped to expand the limited worldview that the Europeans had had up till this point. Those who went traveling with as crusaders to the Holy Land saw things that they never imagined, and this would eventually lead to, when the technology was invented, the age of exploration. It sparked interest in travel, and a few of the very earliest explorers came from this experience. Marco Polo, who traveled in within a few, 100 years of the Crusades, went to China and brought back tales of civilizations and peoples that the Europeans had a very hard time accepting. In fact, Marco Polo was even thrown in prison for saying what people considered to be lies. So he was not believed when he came back with stories of his travels. But this began the tendency to start looking outwards and exploring the world that they only now were becoming aware of. In Spain, Christians were beginning to reconquer the territories that had been taken by the Muslim Moors. By 1300, the majority of the Spanish peninsula, or the Iberian Peninsula, had been reconquered by Christian monarchs. But Spain was actually still many different little kingdoms within the peninsula. And in 1469, two of the largest kingdoms were united in the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. And this unification made it possible for them to unite their forces to make the final push and get the Muslims completely out of Spain. So in 1492, they had the final battle, and they celebrated by sponsoring a interesting little endeavor to go to China, going towards the west rather than going all the way around Africa towards the east. And this became known as Columbus's adventure which discovered the New World. Unfortunately, the Spanish Christians, and especially Isabel and Ferdinand, were very uninterested in toleration of different religious groups, unlike the Muslim Moors, who had tolerated Jews and Christians as long as they paid their extra taxes. So Jews and Christians would have had to pay more, but they were still considered people of the book. Under Isabel and Ferdinand, however, those privileges were not extended to Muslims. Muslims were encouraged to leave or to convert to Christianity. And so many of them did leave rather than convert. But they also began focusing on the Jewish population that had settled in Spain, and they forced many Jews to convert to Christianity. But some Jews refused, and they ended up moving to Eastern Europe or also to the newly discovered Caribbean islands. Because Isabel wanted to create a religious unity in Spain, she ended the toleration of non-Christians, and more than 150,000 Jews and Muslims fled from Spain. She introduced also something called the Inquisition, which tried people who were accused of heresy. It was a special position that was created by the Catholic Church to try to purify the beliefs of the people. And since Spain had just recently come out of Muslim control, they were a prime target for this type of endeavor. So many refused to conform and were burned at the stake.